Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn Spotlight session. I'm Sharon Gaynor, Training and Research Assistant with Haven Horizons. Haven Horizons is a national domestic, sexual and gender-based violence prevention centre. For the benefit of anyone joining our Lunch and Learn for the first time, these weekly sessions were developed as part of Haven Horizons' virtual community of practice, which brings together academics, frontline professionals and others involved in the field of domestic, sexual and gender-based abuse. Our community of practice promotes collaborations and the sharing of knowledge and resources. Members and non-members are welcome to attend the weekly Lunch and Learn sessions on Teams. The link is posted regularly to our social media pages, as well as within the community of practice. And you can share this link with any colleagues who are interested in the prevention of domestic, sexual and gender-based abuse. If you're interested in becoming a member of our community of practice, you can email me on training@havenhorizons.com. Recordings from our Lunch and Learn sessions are also available on our YouTube channel and in the Lunch and Learn section of the community of practice, so feel free to comment on any of the sessions and share your thoughts. You can also keep up to date by following Haven Horizons on our social media platforms or visiting our website, as you can see there, www.havenhorizons.com. We are delighted to welcome Ruth Maxwell to speak with us today. Ruth will give us an overview of the Criminal Injuries Compensation Tribunal scheme, having personal experience of navigating the process following a violent attack in May 2016, which left her with lifelong injuries. The entire process has driven her to use her knowledge and experience to influence change. Her role as a victim advocate and consultant enables her to support other victims through the CICT process, helping to minimise the time it takes to complete the process and reduce some of the additional trauma for victims. Her passion and activism led to her founding the Not Consent campaign, which began in 2018 and was hugely successful in opening conversations surrounding consent and challenging victim-blaming narratives. Ruth regularly consults with policymakers and government on issues relating to law reforms and policy changes, both on national and international levels, as she strives to make the system fairer, faster and victim-focused. I'll pass you over now to Ruth, who will explain some of her work in more detail.
As you've heard, my experience with the Criminal Injuries Compensation Tribunal was deeply personal and also deeply painful. So I often say that when the system that's supposed to protect you becomes the one that harms you, you learn to change it. And that's what today is all about. So the tribunal was created in 1974 to compensate victims of violent crime, and it was funded by the Department of Justice. So it's meant to be an informal, non-adversarial process, a clear, timely and efficient process, and the claim must be made within 3 months of the incident or 2 years under exceptional circumstances. So it was designed to support victims with dignity, but what's written on paper doesn't always match reality. So if the CICT did what it promised, many of us wouldn't be here today still fighting for fairness. So it was originally set up for terrorist attacks in the wake of the IRA bombings, more particularly the Omagh bombing, and it evolved from there to include a large cohort of victims of violent crime in the end. And we can move on to the next slide if that's okay. So my journey into the system, a survivor of a random attack, I had lost everything, in debt, applied to the CICT. There was no choice but to legally represent myself. I challenged many CICT decisions that didn't reflect the evidence in my case. And 4 years to process my application from 2016 until 2020. I received the highest award ever given to someone with my kind of injuries, and it was the first case where the state recognised mental trauma and PTSD. and learned how traumatizing the process is for anyone without resources. So I didn't choose any of that. I was attacked and I'd lost everything, including trust in this system. Proving I was attacked in a high profile and lengthy criminal trial, and then having to prove I suffered life-changing injuries separately, felt like I was put on trial, not once but twice. And I went through it all alone, and that nearly broke me. But it also brought me to the realization of how much reform was needed in this area. Still to this day, I'm quite traumatized over this whole process, but I do my best to try and separate the emotional with the advocacy and reform work. So I could move on to the next slide then. So presently, there's a backlog of 1,100 pending cases, which was from January 2024, and a 40% rise in new applications of 229. So 557 files were sent for decision last year, with up to a 14-month wait, and 203 award payouts in 2024. So victims waiting until new funding from the October budget. Large payouts swallow up the allocated budget, and some victims wait 5 years or more, and many walk away feeling disbelieved, defeated, unable to cope. So no general gender data, no transparency, and no accountability. Women make up a very small minority of applications, which is less than 14%. So trauma is not recognised as a legitimate barrier to engagement, and re-traumatising for vulnerable domestic, sexual, gender-based violence survivors. So these aren't just numbers, they're real people just waiting there in limbo, and victims who gave up because they're weak, but they're not. It's because the system makes it unbearable for them. And we can't fix what we can't track, and if we can't track any of that data, it's not a functional scheme. And that is where, if we can track the actual data in relation to gender, domestic and sexual gender-based violence, then we will really know how many women are in a position to actually receive loss of earnings and medical expenses, and we will know the exact amount that are walking away. And this is where we could have proper statistics to create a victim of violent crime register, which would be really helpful. So the harsh reality of the Criminal Injuries Compensation Tribunal scheme: you have years of delays, no updates, victims forced to prove their trauma repeatedly. There's a trail of paperwork, you need original receipts and report after report. The scheme is bureaucratic and cold, and it's a cruel system for vulnerable victims of crime and bereaved families. The tribunal often refuses late applications, even when there's clear evidence of trauma or legitimate delay. Victims are asked to explain why they didn't apply sooner, which is effectively putting their trauma on trial. Justice delayed becomes justice denied by the state. So it's not just slow, it is cold, it's bureaucratic, and it's unforgiving. And it puts your trauma on trial, asking victims repeatedly to prove their pain. And that's not justice, that's cruelty. So the power imbalance and the human cost. Awards of 75,000 upwards are adjudicated by 3 state legal representatives. Victims are told it's informal and are advised not to use legal representation. The Criminal Injuries Compensation Tribunal can decide if victims are of good character or not. Victims are required to assist the tribunal in gathering information, processes unclear and causing delays. Victims plunged into poverty, job loss, mortgage and rent arrears, massive legal costs, if seeking legal representation. If you appeal, you have a 3-state representatives who can reduce or increase the victim's award at their own discretion. An appeal is considered a new application. Even a question about an award is considered an appeal. So victims are told this process is informal, but the state brings 3 legal representatives to decide your future. People lose jobs, homes, and peace of mind because the process is stacked repeatedly against them at every hurdle. So my experience trying to change the system. 2019, the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre's 40th anniversary panel discussion, which became then crime victims now have some more access to psychological support. And 2019 still participated in the reform of the Parole Act 2019 under the current Minister for Justice. In 2021, the Stalking Bill ensured survivors' input shaped the policy. In 2022, I launched an official Criminal Injuries Compensation Tribunal complaint to the EU Commission. And the outcome, the rules relating to compensable injury, conditions of access to compensation, amount of compensation, procedural requirements, still remain the sole responsibility of the national authorities. So each reform, each panel, each submission, it all started because I had no support whatsoever. And change came from necessity and from refusing to be silent. So contributions to reforming the Criminal Injuries Compensation Tribunal scheme. So in 2019, I addressed the Law Reform Commission Conference on Sentencing and Criminal Injuries Compensation Tribunal failures. That was the launch of their 5th programme of law reform. And in 2019, I had submissions to the Department of Justice and requested to submit to the O'Malley Review. In 2022, my complaint to the EU Commission, which was under the Victims' Rights Directive. And then the same year, contributed extensively to the Law Reform Commission Criminal Injuries Compensation Tribunal reform, the public consultation. And 2025, I published my own independent recommendations for CICT reform and navigating the CICT guide for victims of crime. I'm currently a member of the Victims Advocate Platform at Victim Support Europe, and supported by the Sexual Violence Centre in Cork. So this has been a long road, and reform must be led by those who've lived it. And the guides I created aren't just policy, they're lifelines for the next person who's coming through the system. So challenging rape myths exhibition. So the 2018 Not Consent exhibition launched in Dublin was challenging the narratives around belief, blame and justice. It displayed victims' clothing, challenging victim blaming. Clothes don't cause rape, attitudes do. And in 2019 it launched the NUIG Shag Week, and it went on then to be featured in a BBC Northern Ireland consent documentary highlighting retired Judge Sir John Gillen's positive contributions. And finally in 2022, as part of the Imagine Festival, the Open University in Belfast. And there's a new exhibition due shortly. So survivors are often judged by what they wore, and as if clothes are ever going to invite rape, sexual assault or violence. This exhibition was a stand against blame and a step towards belief and justice. So looking forward, what needs to change? Put the Criminal Injuries Compensation Tribunal on a statutory footing, faster processing of cases and access to interim payments, legal representation for victims, trauma-informed, survivor-led and centred, rights-based and transparent. Publish annual, disaggregated and gender-based data. Provide psychological and legal support for victims and bereaved families. Long-term multidisciplinary supports tailored to the victim's needs. The blanco judgment this year, excluding pain and suffering, breaches EU law, so now Ireland must provide fair and appropriate compensation for pain and suffering. So this isn't just a list, it's a roadmap. Statutory reform, data transparency, survivor-led care, and yes, a proper register stating with clear and concise disaggregated criminal injury compensation tribunal statistics. So my closing message, reform isn't about blame, it's about ensuring the next survivor isn't re-traumatised by the process that's meant to support them. Real reform begins when lived experience is valued as knowledge and not borrowed as evidence. Justice systems should repair rather than re-traumatise. So reform isn't about blame, it's about making sure no one else is re-traumatised. Lived experience is knowledge, and justice should be healing and not harmful.